In this video, I will talk about the biological level of human psychology. First, I will quickly explain how genetics is connected to psychology. Then, I will discuss the two main systems that regulate our behavior: our endocrine system and our nervous system. The first of these will be a brief section, but the latter is the focus of this video. I will describe the anatomical features of the nervous system most important from the point of view of psychology, also explaining the significance of its different parts, including those of the brain. I will explain how typical nerve cells function as well. So, let's get started. My name is Jouni Vilkka, and this is my channel, TFF Teacher from Finland. Please subscribe and click the thumbs up button. Our genetic makeup, together with the environment, directs the development of the individual already from the womb onwards, throughout the whole life. Many psychologically important features strongly depend on one's genes encoded in the DNA. These include one's circadian rhythm and temperament. The latter is the biological basis of personality, observable more directly in babies. It is the individual's innate style of reacting and behaving. Because identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg, they are genetically identical. The fact that a lot of them have grown up separated from each other provides scientists an opportunity to study the significance of genes versus the environment. Twin studies are also used in psychology to study things like the influence of genes on how personality traits or other psychologically interesting features develop. The human body contains endocrine glands that secrete hormones in order to transmit signals to various parts of the body. These form the endocrine system. For example, testosterone and estrogen are hormones secreted by testicles and ovaries. The kidneys make dopamine, the adrenal glands adrenaline, as the name suggests, as well as cortisol. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, and the pituitary gland is responsible for oxytocin. These last two glands are within the brain, the others are not. In the brain, the hypothalamus regulates the concentrations of hormones in blood, signaling the pituitary gland to activate the endocrine glands accordingly. As a method of sending signals, the endocrine system differs greatly from the nervous system in several ways. First, it takes a comparatively long time for the hormones to be circulated in the bloodstream. Second, the so-called signal is transmitted through blood everywhere in the body instead of a single location. The hormones will affect any and all organs in the body that have the correct receptors for the hormone, and will continue to do so for as long as they remain in the bloodstream. Hormones influence our emotions and the body's way to react to stimuli. For example, testosterone and adrenaline are connected to violent behavior. The nervous system is composed of two main parts: the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The nervous system is, as the name implies, made up of nerve cells, which form neural networks. This whole system is very fast, processing stimuli rapidly and then moving on to the next thing. Neural signals do not linger like hormonal signals. The central nervous system, CNS, includes the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, PNS, is connected to the spinal cord, which relays signals to the brain and back to the PNS. Clearly, the brain is the most important and interesting body part from the point of view of psychology. The peripheral nervous system importantly includes the neural connections up from the sensory cells toward the central nervous system, as well as down through the other connections to the muscles to control the movements of the body. This is called the somatosensory system, which allows the CNS to interact with the surrounding environment. The PNS also includes the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. It is autonomic in the sense that it functions without us actively, consciously deciding to perform the function. The ANS is literally vital as it controls the pulse of the heart, breathing and digestion. It does not completely control breathing or even heart rate, but almost. That is why it is so difficult to hold your breath. The ANS includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The first of these is an activating system, so when it is active, it promotes action, survival in dangerous encounters, for example. The latter is the opposite, promoting calmness, relaxation, and healing. The sympathetic nervous system was clearly useful in our evolutionary past, helping our ancestors survive in hostile environments by initiating a fight or flight response. When facing danger, the increased breathing, heart rate, burst of adrenaline, and other physiological changes caused by the system would be useful. In present-day physically safe situations, the same system is activated in situations that are stressful, but for social reasons, not for being physically dangerous. You might be forced to give an important presentation to potential customers in a foreign country, or go out on a date with someone you fancy. And against all your wishes, the same system may be activated. After the stressful event, the parasympathetic nervous system helps you relax. This is certainly useful now, just as it was for our ancestors. The brain is the most important set of organs for our psychology, as all mental experiences and cognition are based on the functioning of the brain. It contains about 100 billion, that is 100,000 million nerve cells, or neurons. These are connected to each other through synapses, of which there are 100 times more than there are neurons. It is no wonder that the human brain has been called the most complex system in the known universe. It is important even for our physiological functioning, as it takes up about 20% of the oxygen and 25% of the glucose we consume. There is a myth according to which we only use 10% of our brain. This originated, as far as I know, from a misunderstanding of a scientific report using brain scan images. The point of the report was to show how at a given time certain parts of the brain were active, but the point was never that we generally use only a small fraction of our brain. When you flex your bicep to lift something or to show off, you are not flexing your tricep at the same time. Similarly, certain parts of the brain are active when it is their turn, and activations spread around the brain depending on what tasks are being performed. So we do use all of our brain, but all of the brain is not activated simultaneously, just like we don't flex all of our muscles simultaneously all the time. What each part of the brain does is known from observing the effects of damage to specific parts of the brain on some unfortunate patients, and also from studies done using various techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. The latter enables the researchers to observe activations in the brain as the subject performs specific actions. Starting from top down, we have inside our skulls what people probably usually think of as the brain. This largest part of the brain is called the cerebrum. It is divided very clearly into two hemispheres, left and right, connected by a structure called corpus callosum. That structure importantly connects the two halves to each other, allowing them to communicate and function together as a whole. I will return to explain the significance of the cerebrum shortly, but let us first take a look at the rest of the brain. At the back of the head and below the cerebrum is located the little brain, cerebellum. It also is divided into left and right hemispheres. The cerebellum is important for motor skills, coordination, balance, and procedural memory, remembering how to do things. It is my understanding that automated tasks like riding a bike are possible because of the cerebellum. Below and partially inside the cerebrum are structures like pons, Latin for bridge, and the medulla or medulla oblongata that are part of the brain stem and act as the bridge between the spinal cord and the brains. These parts of the brain are in control of involuntary actions like heart rate and breathing, among other things. Clearly, this is a vital part of the CNS. The thalamus and the limbic system are deep within the cerebrum, above the pons. The thalamus is a central hub through which all sense signals, except those of smell, travel from the sensory organs to various parts of the brain for processing. It is also important for regulating sleep, consciousness, and alertness. The limbic system processes emotions and memories. The sense of smell is directly connected to it, not through the thalamus. It includes the hippocampus, which is important especially for memory and learning, and the amygdala, which connects emotions to memories, and the hypothalamus, which regulates things like blood pressure and appetite. The cerebrum, the largest and topmost structure of the brain, is the most important part of the brain for our cognitive functions. The thin layer forming the surface of the cerebrum, called the cortex or cerebral cortex, is where the most important of these functions are performed. Although the brain does work as a whole, the two hemispheres of the brain have slightly different functions. This is called lateralization. Most importantly, this is seen in how the sensations and movement of the left side of the body are processed in the right hemisphere and vice versa. The left hemisphere is also associated more strongly than the right with tasks requiring language. The right hemisphere is more associated with visual spatial ability. Both hemispheres are divided into lobes, and there are 4 on both sides. The frontal lobe in the front, as you might have guessed, the temporal lobe on the side, behind the temple, the parietal lobe on the top, and the occipital lobe at the back. The occipital lobe is where visual information is processed. The temporal lobe is associated with hearing, speech comprehension, language, and emotions. The frontal lobe is in charge of interpreting emotions, executive functions, making decisions, and planning, as well as language production. It is the area of the brain that develops last. Pretty much on top of the brain, in both hemispheres, the primary somatosensory cortex receives tactile information from the sensory neurons in the skin, and the primary motor cortex, right next to it, sends the signals for controlling the movements of the muscles. The parts of the body that are more important for our tactile sense, such as our lips, are represented in the brain by a large area of the cortex, and other parts that are not as important, like the arms, have a smaller area of the cortex reserved for processing their signals. This is visualized with the sensory homunculus and motor homunculus. I want to emphasize that this is a very general overview of the brain, and especially the cortex. I have mentioned some functions that are connected to specific lobes, but it should not be thought that the whole lobe is activated for a given function. Instead, there are more specific areas within the lobe for specific tasks. For example, Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe is important for speech comprehension, and Broca's area in the frontal lobe for language production. The prefrontal cortex in the front of the frontal lobe is important for the highest cognitive functions. The way most people are probably used to thinking about brains is a bit wrong in the sense that living or freshly removed brains don't look like how we are used to thinking they look like. That is because the common image of a brain is based on preserved brains. The preservation process makes them grey. It also makes them firm enough to be handled and, for example, sliced for research purposes. Without such treatment, the brain would be damaged too easily. It is so fragile that it would be damaged under its own weight, if not kept floating in the cerebrospinal fluid as it is within the skull. The fresh brain is more pink than grey. A slice of the preserved brain is made up of grey and white areas. The cortex is the grey part, and the deeper parts are white. It is not the volume of the brain, but the surface area that is important for cognitive functions. That is why it makes sense that the cerebral cortex has lots of folds that increase the surface area significantly. The shapes formed by this folding have Latin names, although the pronunciation varies. The folds or ridges are called gyri. The single form is gyrus, gyros. And the grooves are called sulci. The single form is sulcus. The different colorings of these parts of the brain is due to what they are made of. The neurons that form the neural networks making our cognitive abilities possible, and roughly as many glial cells or glia that have several important functions. Their importance is often overlooked, but I don't want to repeat that mistake here, and so we'll explain their functions first. First of all, glial cells form the structures that hold the whole brain together. Neurons are too fragile for that. The glial cells also provide the neurons with oxygen and nutrients, especially glucose, and remove waste material from the brain, even destroying harmful pathogens. They are important for the immune response as well. They also insulate neurons from one another, which is important for their functioning, as you will soon see. All the nerve cells in the body, the brain included, are called neurons. The structures of the neuron include the soma, which is the main part of the cell, in the sense that the other structures are connected to it. The cortex has a lot of somas in it, which is why it appears grey in the slices I mentioned earlier. That is why the term grey matter is used. Below the cortex, the white matter, as it is called, consists to a great degree of the second biggest part of the neuron, the axon, and the glia that form a myelin sheath around many of these axons, a process that begins during the person's childhood. The myelin sheath increases the speed of signal transmission in the neuron, at least partly explaining how a child's abilities increase and become faster as the child grows. Myelin is a fatty, white substance that is the main reason why this part of the brain appears white in the brain slices. The neuron also includes lots of dendrites connected to the soma, but they are much smaller than the axon, of which they only ever have one. There are several types of neurons, but to keep things simple, I will just explain the most simple type. All the neurons function the same way though, and it is important to understand that there is always just one axon, and the impulse the neuron sends always has the same direction, from the soma through the axon outwards. Often brain activity is depicted as electrical impulses, and it is correct in that the signals in the brain do have an electric component in how the impulse, action potential, happens in the axon. As I mentioned, the myelin sheath makes it more efficient. It does not uniformly cover the whole axon, but instead forms internodes separated by nodes of Ranvier. Instead of creeping through the axon little by little, the electrical signal jumps from one node of Ranvier to the next. This is how the insulating myelin sheath makes the signal travel faster. The axon can have many axon terminals, ending in terminal buttons, like branches connected to one or several other neurons. Often they are connected to the dendrites of the other cell, but could be connected to other parts of the cell as well. In some cases, the axon is connected to a muscle or a gland, but within the brain they are typically connected to other neurons. These connections are called synapses. They are where the most interesting things happen. In the standard type of synapse, the two cells are not in fact touching each other. Instead, there is a synaptic gap or cleft between them. The signal from the presynaptic cell has to cross this synaptic gap in order to influence the postsynaptic cell. The presynaptic cell produces chemical neurotransmitters which end up in synaptic vesicles at the axon terminal in the synapse. On the other side of the gap await the receptors. When the action potential occurs, the neurotransmitters are released from the vesicles into the gap, where they will float in the extracellular fluid and likely will connect with the receptors on the other side. If not, they can end up back where they started due to what is called reuptake. Or they can be cleared out as waste, getting broken down by enzymes in the fluid. The receptors are proteins on the surface of the postsynaptic cell that have a lock and key relationship with transmitters. They will only connect with specific kinds of transmitter molecules. If the transmitters do end up in the receptors, they will either have an excitatory or an inhibitory effect on the postsynaptic neuron. This is due to chemistry that I won't cover here, but the point is that a neuron is likely to be connected to a number of other neurons. Some of these other neurons send our neuron excitatory signals, while others send inhibitory signals. Nothing will happen in the neuron we are focusing on unless the excitatory signals reach the action potential threshold, also known as the threshold of excitation. When that happens, the neuron suddenly begins an action potential. It is a discrete signal, meaning that it always has the same intensity, so there are no stronger or weaker signals, and the signal has the same strength throughout the axon. All that can change is the frequency at which the neuron sends the signal. The signal begins at the cell body, soma, and travels to the axon terminals. The direction is thus always the same. Once the neuron has fired, there will be a brief refractory period that lasts for 1 millisecond, during which the neuron cannot fire again. It will then return to the resting state, meaning it can again fire. The communication between neurons is thus an electrochemical event. The action potential is the electrical part of the event, and the movement of the neurotransmitters through the synaptic cleft, the chemical part. There are many neurotransmitters, each with different roles to play. For example, acetylcholine is associated with memory and arousal of the mind, not the sexual kind. Dopamine is associated with pleasure and bodily movement. Serotonin, or serotonin transporter, with mood and phases of sleep. These are just some examples, there are many more. Neuroplasticity refers to the ability of the brain to adapt and change. The structures of, or connections between, neurons are what enable us to perform cognitive tasks like learn, think, remember, and so on. This is due to the networks they create, strengthen, or remove. Our experiences, how we use or don't use our brains, affects what kinds of connections the neurons form. They can also be influenced by injuries and recovering from those injuries. Glutamate is a transmitter that seems to play an important part in neuroplasticity. I have already mentioned that the brain floats in cerebrospinal fluid. It seems important enough to point out that within the brain there are cavities called ventricles. These are the areas where the fluid is generated, and the cavities are connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. That is why the fluid is called the cerebrospinal fluid. It is the same fluid within the skull and within the spine, surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. The fluid has several functions. It helps absorb blows caused by rapid acceleration or deceleration of the head. For example, if you fall down or get punched in the jaw. Metabolic waste is easily diffused from the brain and cleared away into the bloodstream with the help of cerebrospinal fluid. The fluid is also needed for homeostatic regulation of the brain. Homeostasis refers to the state of balance that all living systems strive for automatically, because it is necessary for their performance and even survival. For example, in humans, the concentration of sodium in the body, the amount of glucose in the bloodstream, body temperature, and the right amount of sleep are organic or biological motives that are necessary to be satisfied. Hypothalamus, a part of the limbic system in the lower part of the brain, regulates these. There are, of course, blood vessels in the brain as well. The blood-cerebrospinal fluid barrier, BCSFB, and the blood-brain barrier, BBB, are biological mechanisms that prevent most harmful substances from reaching the CNS, where they might cause problems. This also makes it difficult to develop drugs that manage to bypass these barriers in order to have the desired effect on the brain, to treat mental illnesses, for example. I have now explained the simplified basics of how hormones and neurons work and what the main structures of the brain are. I hope I have made it clear how inseparable our biology is from our mental abilities. Biopsychology will be discussed in a bit more detail in the third course of psychology, so I will return to the subject eventually. This is enough biology for a mere introduction to psychology. My next video will focus on the mental level and how psychology studies cognition and consciousness. See you then. Bye. If you wish to support my channel, please click thumbs up, subscribe, and share my videos. Any comments on the videos would also be welcome.